Hello, welcome to a special live edition of Telesour's The Empire Files. I'm your host, Abby Martin. We're in Baltimore at the Real News Network Media Center, where we just watched the first Democratic Party debate for the 2016 presidential election. And now we have a panel here to respond. We'll also be taking questions from our viewers, so please tweet out with the hashtag #DebateTheDebate if you want to hear something from our panel. First, to introduce our panel tonight, Jared Ball, producer at the Real News Network and host of I Mix What I Like; Bhaskar Sunkara, founder-editor of Jacobin Magazine and senior editor at Indies Times; Sarah Jaffe, reporting fellow at the Nation Institute, co-host of Dissent Magazine's Belabored podcast; Jill Carter, delegate of Maryland's 41st Legislative District; and Kamau Franklin, attorney, organizer, and writer. Thank you so much, all of you, for taking the time out of your busy schedules for joining us tonight in this really exciting debate. Jill, I wanted to start with you, and I wanted to start with playing a clip from Hillary, something interesting she said about being a progressive. Let's take a listen.
Just for the record, are you a progressive or are you a moderate?
I'm a progressive, but I'm a progressive who likes to get things done.
Necessary to work with moderates and to maybe capitulate some ideals in order to get things done as a progressive?
It's absolutely essential because, frankly, in Maryland and in the United States Congress, the majority of legislators are certainly not progressive. But actually, I thought that the comment was a little condescending on the part of Hillary, because I think politically she has not historically been a progressive at all. And then, in addition to that, the fact that, you know, she kind of in a certain way demeaned progressives by saying progressive that gets things done, I thought it was a little offensive, a little insulting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I wanted to talk about
being disingenuous.
Yeah, I found it odd that it was framed immediately, who here's a capitalist? Let's get that out of the way. What's your electability, Bernie Sanders? And I wanted to play that clip of kind of putting him on the spot and putting everyone else on the spot. Do you or do you not agree with the foundation of capitalism? Okay, well, the clip isn't working, but you guys all listened to that. I mean, it was really bizarre. Bhaskar, I wanted to get your response to kind of Hillary saying, I'm a capitalist, and I think that capitalism can save it from itself if we need to, and just kind of disenfranchising Bernie right out of the gate.
Well, it's really funny how this is framed. It's like, what do they mean when they say, are you a capitalist? Does she own sweatshops? Does she employ a bunch of people, you know, sewing stuff for her to sell it in the market for a profit? You know, maybe she in fact does. But it is funny because that's considered the default. Because what they're really saying is, are you a realist? Are you serious? Or are you Bernie Sanders? And that was kind of the point of that question. And I think Sanders responded quite well by just saying that, no, he's not a capitalist, because if capitalist means the status quo, he's fighting for something different.
Mm-hmm. Kamau, what was your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, I thought Bernie Sanders gave a careful answer. I wasn't impressed by his answer, because he said, he specifically said, I'm not a crony capitalist. So I think he sort of tried to hedge his bets. But I think what happened was that the larger debate was setting something within the confines of the sort of the paradigm allowed in sort of American mainstream political circles. You have to be a capitalist, you have to be pro-war, you have to sort of set certain standards and a floor in order to be considered electable. And I think CNN was playing this sort of historic role as corporate media in making sure those sort of ground rules were set, and that Bernie Sanders in particular was sort of targeted to be the person outside the loop because he's the biggest challenger to Clinton in this sort of Democratic primary season.
Jared, I found it interesting also that Bernie refuses to critique Hillary, even on that plane, when she is the billionaire class. Her husband's the billionaire class. I mean, you can't point at anyone more than them and say, you're not part of this elite, yet he refuses. Even then, when he's bringing up this time and again, he won't turn to her.
Well, first, I mean, honestly, I think he should check out your more recent edition of Empire Files and get his writers to help him out with the definition of socialism. I mean, he was, I thought, particularly weak in explaining why his position as a democratic socialist, or what that is and why that would be better. I didn't think he, you know, he needed some help there. He should check out, you know, what Brian Becker was saying in your piece there. But also, you know, but I think he can't critique her because he's already said he's going to support her if she gets the nomination. So he's not going to go too far to put her out there as the class enemy as she is. Because he's looking forward to supporting her. And he, in fact, was in some ways helping her with her equally I think, a ridiculous attempt to position herself as both an outsider and someone who is decidedly experienced enough to be president. But the idea that Hillary Clinton is an outsider and a class friend to a Democratic socialist is absurd. So I mean, but again, I think because Bernie has wedded himself to the Democratic Party, which is part of my larger critique of what he's doing anyway. I mean, he's got a semi-decent platform. He's just in a party that can't accommodate it. So he's got to stay within those confines, and therefore he can't be too hard on what he, I think, even thinks is going to be the nominee of his party.
And Sarah, I wanted to turn to you. He brings up a good point, and that's what Chris Hedges has said time and again, is that he's like a sheepdog corralling legitimization for the Democratic Party, because he even said that he would ultimately endorse the candidate. I mean, it's a very slim chance that Bernie Sanders will actually get the nomination. What do you think about him running within the party and kind of refusing to critique the billionaire class in terms of Hillary?
I was sitting there listening to a 10-minute discussion about the merits of socialism in a Democratic Party debate where millions of people just watched that. If he was running as a third-party candidate, that wouldn't have happened. Now, granted, the Democratic Party has a lot of problems, but that just happened. And that is, I cannot picture that happened 4 years ago, 8 years ago, certainly. I remember some of Hillary's arguments were recycled from 8 years ago. Right. And so, like, that I find a really fascinating thing that just happened there. It wasn't the definition of socialism that I would have given. It's not the party that I would choose to run in. But it is an interesting thing that is happening now that I don't think we can just, throw out completely.
Yeah, totally. And Bhaskar, you've written about this extensively. Of course, at this time in 2008, there was this huge economic crash. I mean, the wars, everyone was disgusted with the Bush administration viscerally. And so Obama comes in, sweeps everyone off their feet. How are conditions today different? I mean, you could argue that that was in part symbolic. Here you have Bernie Sanders, much different rhetoric, white guy, old. How are conditions today different that's responsible for this huge swell of support?
Well, I think one thing is it's actually quite a bit easy. If there's one good thing that came out of the Obama years, it was that no one could say the only thing we need to do is put a Democrat in the White House. So during the Bush years, there was this, and you saw this in the anti-war movement, there's this constant push that we just need a Democrat. Or maybe we need something better, but to start with, we need a Democrat. And I think Obama kind of rode that very kind of an anti-Bush sentiment that didn't go much deeper than that. Whereas I think Sanders now is actually tapping into the energy of a lot of people who see that it's not just a matter of electing a Democrat, it's a matter of electing people with a different sort of program and platform, and someone who actually wants to confront power and actually take things from billionaires and millionaires and lots of people, in between. And I think that's something that Sanders did, and you didn't really hear in the 2008 at all. And I think that's his real value and contribution. And I completely agree there are severe limits to the Democratic Party and running into that. And I hope that Sanders can be a stepping stone so we can build the movements that can actually go and transform and go beyond the Democratic Party, not in 20, 30 years, but in 5, 10 years. But I just don't see it happening from scratch or from just an outside or third-party presidential run right away.
Kamau, I wanted to turn to you and just bring up something that I found interesting was Lincoln Chafee. This guy was an interesting character. But then again, he has some really out there foreign policy in terms of like super pro-peace. He wants to wage peace. He wants to ban drones. He wants peace talks with ISIS even. Very interesting, provocative talking point. Shouldn't anti-war activists be supporting this guy?
No. Well, I think on some levels, some of the rhetoric in the Democratic Party is shifting to the left, right? And I think that's a direct result of the recession, of the near collapse of the Iraq War. So I think the American electorate is split in several different ways. You have particularly the white American electorate. So you have some which are tilting left with other populations, but you have a great deal particularly that are tilting right. So I don't think that even within the confines of what's happening, whether Democrat or Republican, what you're really getting is people trying to sort of corral their base, what they think could be potential their bases, and if they were so lucky to be the standard bearer of their party, then they would do what they standardly do, which is also then begin to tilt in the middle. So I think it is interesting times. It's interesting rhetoric, but I don't think within the confines of what we're talking about of how American elections operate and work, that we're really going to see something that much different when it comes down to who actually is going to run and/or win the national election.
Mm-hmm. Sarah, you've argued that Black Lives Matter disrupting Bernie's campaign event was one of the best things that happened in the election, and that's what's cool about disrupting these events, getting the rhetoric on the forefront, getting people to address these issues. I mean, are these types of tactics the only things that we can really propel people to address these things?
Well, ultimately, I don't think change is going to come from whoever gets elected president this time or the next time or the next 20 times. And Bernie kind of made my point there, so now I feel like I'm just parroting what he said. But I think change does come from people who are organized, who are, masses in motion. And I think that is, we're seeing that when the question was framed sort of horribly tonight, but do Black Lives Matter? And they knew exactly what the answer they were supposed to give was, which they could not do a couple months ago. And the fact that they're talking about economic inequality, the fact that Hillary Clinton, who just got $600 and something thousand in speaking fees from Goldman Sachs, is now talking about putting bankers in jail, is because Occupy Wall Street happened. Right. I don't, for the record, think that anybody needs to go to jail. I think we should get rid of the jails. But just, the fact that that is an argument that she's willing to make now is...
Yet no one's calling her out on the fact that Citigroup, JP Morgan, Chase bankroll her, and here she is talking about banks. I mean, it's just kind of a joke. But Jill, I wanted to turn to you in terms of the Black Lives Matter question. Of course, as a Maryland representative, were you satisfied with their responses?
Well, no, it's kind of interesting. Even after the episode that happened a while back with Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley, he still wasn't able to bring himself tonight to say Black Lives Matter. He skated all around the issue. Of course, Hillary never mentioned it at all. So I was kind of surprised that even after they kind of had the testing ground, the dress rehearsal, they still weren't able to deliver on that issue tonight. And even though there was some lip service given to prison reform and police reform, there was actually nothing more than just those blanket statements, but no actual fundamental discussion about how that would look. So it was pretty disappointing overall. And I think that what we see is that we're never going to have. I mean, I think to bring that into the other question, I think as long as you have these two parties, you're never going to have any kind of fundamental change. And I think that what you saw even with Bernie, with the Democratic Socialists, it was all gamesmanship. It's all, his expressed support of Hillary is all because he's there to bring people into the party that ordinarily would probably go somewhere else. And then once they're in, they're stuck in, and their choice will be, Hillary or the nominee versus the Republican. So I thought that was the role, he served his role.
Your response? Well.
Oh, no, I mean, I think that's accurate. I mean, I do give credence to, there's an opening that I think Bernie Sanders, if I look at the debate purely on populist economic rhetoric, I think Bernie Sanders won the debate. I think he gave progressive answers. I think he talked a lot about, obviously, billionaire, millionaire classes, and I do think that matters, right? I think talking about the economic classes matter, right? But when it comes down to it, I don't think he has a chance to win, right? And so I think Hillary Clinton, again, is being positioned in a certain way to protect her left flank by tilting left when necessary. But I think her history says who she is as a politician. And I do think that there was a lot of accurate sort of accusations or things put out there around her switching on different issues and looking like somebody who will say almost anything to get elected. And I think that was something that also became clear.
Right, and especially since hedge fund managers who are bankrolling her have said, oh, we're not worried about her populist rhetoric. We know that she's just lying and just saying whatever she wants to try to get elected. Yeah. So, I mean, all we have to do is listen to her funders. Bhaskar, I want to turn to you because you've argued that Sanders will strengthen the left in the long run. Support for Bernie is a good thing because even though he won't win, it'll still push voters to the left and leave Clinton's base splintered, where they're kind of saying, we're disenfranchised now from the establishment Democrats, and correct me if I'm wrong, and then we'll kind of turn toward more radical politics. I'm worried because I feel like the opposite happened with Obama, where people were totally demoralized and actually became apolitical after his election.
Well, I think Obama wasn't actually a challenge from the left. But to begin with, this is, when I say this is the possibility. This is the chance. The chance, as far as I could see, I mean, I'm a member of the U.S. left. It's small. We do good things sometimes, but it's a small group of people. So I basically take it a level of risk reward, and I see a potential reward, and I see the reward outweighing the risk. But I think that if we are to build a strategy, it can't just be regrouping and reorganizing the same 5, 6, 7,000 people. It has to be trying to tap a wider base, and that comes from more organizing, more activity in social movements. That should be our primary priority. But it also means trying to carve out a section of that Democratic base and separating that base from people like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, and if need be, even Bernie Sanders. And I think of the Bernie Sanders campaign as a chance to actually take people who would otherwise be, yes, maybe staying at home, but chances are probably supporting someone as odious as O'Malley or even Webb, who, if you listen to the debate, seems absolutely deranged. He's talking about grenades, and he really does. And so I actually don't think that I don't think there's an idea. As much as I'll use her as an example, Jill Stein. As much as I like Jill Stein, I don't think this energy that's going to Bernie Sanders would have been going to Jill Stein, even if, honestly, when it comes down to it, I know I'll be voting for Jill Stein, over the alternatives, next November. So I really do think it's just a matter of risk-reward, and I actually think it's up to us to make sure that Sanders stays honest and actually doesn't capitulate. And when he does, because we're expecting him to endorse Clinton, it's at that point that everyone supporting Bernie Sanders needs to openly say, we reject this action. This isn't what the campaign stood for. It stands for something else, and now we need to do something else. And at that point, maybe it'll be supporting Green Party run, maybe it'll be other activity, but that's our only chance.
Jared, do you have a response?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't share that optimism in the same way. I mean, I'm in some ways shocked, yet I do understand how we have not apparently learned from the 8 years of Obama, that all the euphoria. I mean, to me, Bernie Sanders only exists to capture the lost euphoria with the exit of Obama. So to give the Democratic Party a way of addressing what all the people, what majority of the people in the country and around the world really want, the kind of changes we really want, without saying go to another party. So I mean, I don't, just is the same way. I don't think I think the point was already made. The left, I don't think got a big bump after Obama was elected. I don't think Sanders' campaign is going to help the left in any way. If anything, I think that these campaigns do more to confuse what exists as the so-called left, and I'm not even sure what that really means at this point either. But I think that to the extent that we are not, going just to this Black Lives Matter question, I don't think that they should be addressing themselves at all to these major party candidates. They should be addressing themselves to alternative options and to communities and encouraging alternative options for electoral politics, whether it's supporting more left-leaning, locally based politicians, or ultimately developing an alternative party. I mean, I think that they should be in Maryland telling black people to join the Ojima People's Party. They should be going around encouraging people to join the Green Party or the Party for Socialism and Liberation, or developing something that doesn't exist and say, this is where our energy needs to go. If we are going to look towards electoral politics as a means to address the concerns we have, and I'm, George Jackson on this, in the sense that, what is as he said, what good is the vote after the fact of monopoly capital? So, I mean, I'm not excited about voting as a move or a catch fly for so-called radicals in the first place. But if the goal, if the decision is made that we on the left are going to use electoral politics at all, we need to be doing something wildly different, and we can't be chasing after these. I mean, if Bernie Sanders was so great, I mean, he's been in Congress for so long. I mean, where has been this energy and this movement, or the policies or the successes that he could demonstrate over 20 some odd years, showing, look, these are my politics and this is how I've made them a reality? He doesn't have that. He's sort of been dragged out at the last minute here to save the party in its post-Obama moment, knowing full well, as they do, that Hillary, who I think was supposed to have been the follow-up, we gave you your black man, now we're going to give you your white woman, but with all the problems that she's attached to, they're saying, well, we need somebody else. So here comes Bernie. Again, he's already said, I will deliver my supporters to the eventual nominee anyway, and here we are. So I mean, I just don't see where the bump for the left is going to come from Bernie's campaign. If anything, I think he's going to, I think continue to weaken and fracture that group.
I share the same fear in the sense that it almost legitimizes the entire system to say, look how far someone like Bernie Sanders can go. Look, he really has a chance. Look, guys. I mean, Kamau, you worked on a really successful campaign for a radical in a local election. It was a rare victory, but talk about how that change can happen. I mean, was it just a local one-off success?
Well, in some ways, it came from years, some decades of grassroots community organizing and someone who established themselves as a focal point of sort of an oppositional candidate in Jackson, Mississippi. And so that came with hard work. It came with, again, grassroots organizers. It came with support both in Jackson and outside of Jackson. And so the table was set by the time we decided to enter the electoral politics field of having somebody who was recognized as sort of a fighter for his people. And so I think, I mean, I agree with Jared that some of this starts on a local level. And this national thing becomes this moment where we all get caught up in. And again, I think it's good that the rhetoric is shifting left, and I think that talks about what's happening in the country. But I also think there's ways in which the rhetoric is shifting rightward, obviously, right, what's happening in the country. But it starts with local grassroots campaigns, not only on the issues that are important, but then identifying people who've been trained, who are dedicated, who are connected to grassroots organizations, and therefore feel that if they don't do what they say they're going to do, then there's some punishment.
There's actually responsibility to be had, absolutely.
I mean, I think this is the great point. And I think in microcosm, what happened with Chokwe Lumumba in Jackson, Mississippi needs to be expanded nationally. That this grassroots campaign with someone who has a track record of clear dedication to real grassroots radical politics that would be good for the community would manifest itself in a culminating campaign. What we're doing is waiting for the top to give somebody to us and say, here's Bernie. Get excited and run to it, and then when it doesn't have the push that existed there in that even small scale.
Right. I mean, why should we continue to vote for the lesser of two evils when there are third parties who defy the duopoly, but they're constantly marginalized, Bhaskar?
Well, I mean, I think. Well, let's say I'll give you one anecdote, one example, and this is I invite people at home to try this at home. I went to a Bernie Sanders meeting. And I said, my name is Bhaskar Sunkara. I'm a socialist. Applause. I support Bernie Sanders. Okay, applause. All right, that one was a gimme. I didn't have to work too hard for that one. And I will not support Hillary Clinton if she's a Democratic nominee, even if Bernie Sanders supports her. Applause again. What that is that to me is what the Sanders campaign can give us. It can give us a space for politics. And yes, this is just national presidential politics, and this isn't the most important sphere for us to be organizing. We need to be organizing social movements. We need to be running independent campaigns like Sama Swant's, like Chokwe Lumumba's campaign in Jackson, like those types of campaigns. But I think at the national level, this is welcome, because otherwise it would have just been Jim Webb and it would have been O'Malley talking twice as much.
About their family, personal anecdotes about his wife and kids. Jill,
and
you're
the person he killed in Vietnam.
Right. Yeah, that was bizarre.
We assume in Vietnam.
Well,
yeah, I don't know. I'm just saying. Jim sounds like a wild dude. I don't know.
Jill, you're to the left of most Democrats. I mean, what has your experience been like working within the establishment, and how hard do you think it would be to enact national change as a Democrat?
It's been extremely difficult, and I think that it's impossible within the current two-party structure to enact real revolutionary change or real reform. I think that what you said at Bernie's meeting, what they bank on is that they know that there's ultimately not going to be another viable alternative, and so ultimately all support is going to go to the Democrat nominee, in terms of the Democrats, and that's going to be the only choices that people are going to have. So I think that on local levels, like you said, there's a chance to do something different. But I think that that's where you have to start and then build the way up. I think starting at the top down is probably too ambitious.
Jared, as someone who ran for Green Party, dovetailing off of what Jill just said, I mean, yeah, there's no one that's going to be out there saying, everyone, let's do this. I mean, everyone who's watching Bernie Sanders' campaign and wants you know, Hillary gets a nomination, let's say that happens, who's going to galvanize the energy? I mean, is Bernie going to be out there saying this? I mean, when we marginalize third parties to the point where people say, you're wasting your vote when you vote third party, that's never going to give them a chance.
Right. Well, I mean, you know, from my limited experience, and then, you know, ultimately supporting, you know, Rosa Clemente and Cynthia McKinney in that 2008 campaign, I think that I mean, what I saw happening there was that we had not done enough of the groundwork to build up a sort of critical mass to support that kind of effort. And I think one of the biggest flaws in that is that we have not, as a so-called alternative outside or left or radical community, done enough of the groundwork to build up all of these other structures, including a radical alternative media that would give space to these kind of candidates and these kinds of conversations, that would give people who are looking for an alternative to the madness we watched tonight somewhere to go. And so I think, I do think what is being done here with the Real News is important, and what Telesur is trying to do in support of these kinds of things internationally is important. But we need more of that, and we need more people to build these, to be willing to say, look, I'm not going to vote for the lesser of two evils. I know that this is, I want to vote with my conscience. I want to respect the people who really did fight and die for us to have the right to vote, which was not about giving us the right to vote for one of the corporate, ruling elite capitalist parties. That was not the whole point of getting the right to vote. And then we would maybe be able to have, make a move again, if the goal is to use electoral politics. If that is the goal, then we have to begin to do the kinds of things and build off. I mean, Du Bois said, what was it, 50 years ago, Du Bois said, I'm not voting for these parties anymore. We've had people make these statements before, and we have people who claim to study these people, these heroes and, excuse me, and great leaders who have made these statements, we claim we want to study, Dr. King and Malcolm X, all of whom said we need to do, if we're going to use the vote, we need to do something wildly different and radical with it. And instead of, I think, adhering to those calls and building up this infrastructure, we just kind of keep coming back to this, and then it becomes too easy, and then we're encouraged, if not, I mean, that's putting it politely, to say, if you don't do this, if you don't vote for Hillary, then we're turning the world over to Donald Trump, or if you don't vote for Bernie, we're turning the world over to Hillary. And meanwhile, we are where we are. And all the stats that they were reading up there, I mean, when I'm listening to Bernie and Hillary and everyone else read these stats about how deplorable the conditions are for people in this country and around the world, I'm looking at them saying, but you've been in the leadership of all this nonsense. Why should we now come back to you and reaffirm your credibility instead of saying all of you and the structures that produce you? Because this ultimately is not about Bernie or Hillary or any of that. It's about the apparatus, the institutions, the processes that push them to these positions. And if we don't address that, then, so I mean, I would have, in the interim between now and whatever the next election people want to point to, we should be spending more time focused on these alternative parties, supporting them, joining them, helping build them as alternatives, and giving media space to them to debate and be heard, and then see if ultimately that doesn't make any, headway.
If I can add one quickly. Yeah, I mean, and because I completely agree. I will say, though, that I never blame people for voting for lesser of two evils, because I think that's what's presented to them. And I do think it's the left, the radicals, the folks who talk about what the alternative is. If we don't present those alternatives, then it's our fault. And so I think that's where sort of the shifting of what has to happen on the ground is where sort of like we're the focal point. It's the folks who is claiming or saying that we need to build these alternative institutions, that we need to organize and galvanize our folks. We are the ones who need to figure out what are those structures, what are those good plans. I think in the meantime, people will do what they need to do to survive. And we're not in a parliamentary system, and so they're going to vote for what they think is the lesser of two evils. And again, I don't necessarily, I may try to convince them otherwise, right. But I think the sort of the work is on those who eyes are wide open, right? And if we can see this, and if we're not doing better, then I think it's our fault in some ways.
And if I wasn't clear, that's exactly what I was saying.
Yeah. And I would just add that most people don't vote at all, right? Yeah. That in the average non-presidential election, I think the last time was like 35% turnout. Most people are not voting for these parties anymore. And so there is, in fact, a huge chance to actually mobilize some people with something other than what they're already seeing, if that actually, was presented to them. I live in a fairly small city in upstate New York now, and I'm looking at voter turnout numbers, and the Democratic Party primary for mayor was just one with literally 500 votes. Not one by 500 votes, one with 500 votes in a city of 28,000 people. I'm like, man, we could elect a socialist mayor of this city. I could knock that many doors myself. Heck, maybe I'll run for mayor. You know? Actually, I'm trying to convince my boyfriend to run for mayor instead. But, right, it's literally, these are things that we can do where we live if we actually pay some attention to local politics and not just the endless distraction of the presidential election that we're all here to discuss.
So how can we change our attitudes about elections, Bhaskar, in general, to make people understand that the only elections really that truly matter are local? They're so boring, people are totally disengaged with them, and they're just kind of caught up with this federal election cycle every 4 years.
Well, the problem is, to the extent there's only one election that matters, it is actually these big federal elections. It's just these are the elections that we can't influence at our current level of strength on the left. But in fact, these are the most important elections. But I think we first should sort of change our thinking and start with where a lot of people are at. And a lot of people are only engaged in politics because the environment is so depoliticized, not because they're depoliticized, like they're stupid or they don't care about whatever. It's actually because they're smart enough to know they might as well stay at home. But a lot of people, their only political engagement is once every 4 years and voting. That's why I do think something like the Sanders campaign is useful, just to get people talking about these issues, talking about inequality. And from there, if we're not taking advantage of that moment, that's because of our own weakness. But you can't, I feel like often this gets into, not to use a cliche, but to use a cliche, a chicken or the egg kind of thing, where we don't have the social forces to impact national elections. We don't have the social forces to build a third party. We can't will it out of nothing. So the question is, how do we take the existing pieces that we have and make something with it? So one intermediate thing is we could imagine in the future maybe running explicitly socialist candidates, not connected to the Democratic machine, but perhaps using Democratic primaries in a very different way than Bernie Sanders is using it, but using them as open socialists or open radicals. And correct me if I'm wrong, Lumumba ran through such a process.
Yeah, he ran on the Democratic Party ticket, and we had a big discussion within as to whether or not it made sense to run as a third-party candidate or whether or not it made sense to run within the Democratic primary. And we had extensive debate about it. But what we thought at the particular time was that this was our election to lose. We knew that Chokwe was extremely popular. We knew that black folks were captured within the Democratic Party and saw that as the vehicle, even in Jackson, Mississippi. Others argued that because Chokwe was such a popular organizer and had an apparatus around him, that we possibly could have accomplished the same feat outside of the Democratic Party. But in the end, we decided that this was the safer route to go. And I think there were some good things about that decision, but I also think there were some problematic things about that position. Because then we didn't ever get back to, and by that time I was gone, but we didn't get back to the apparatus of creating some third vehicle. And unfortunately, within the administration, of course, Chokwe passed away shortly after being elected within a year. And so now what's happening in Jackson is almost starting from the ground up and sort of reigniting and trying to refigure out, now how do we do this when we don't have someone as an individual who's so established in the community for 15, 20 odd years, but now we're doing it based on what sometimes some folks think we should have done it in the first place, was the larger name of the organization and the grassroots apparatus that should have been created with or without Chokwe.
Jill, almost every Democratic candidate, including Sanders, of course, Hillary's in a class of her own when it comes to war, but is indistinguishable when it comes to foreign policy pretty much. And that's the part that bothers me, because I don't understand how radical change can happen without tapping into the war machine and getting back those billions of dollars that are being spent on the military-industrial complex. Your thoughts?
I think that you're right, and I think that you're not going to find anything different within the party structure, as we've talked about. Their hands are tied, essentially, from doing anything differently, and it's all going to be tied up to money. And so, speaking of money and money associated with war, a lot of discussion was not really given to that or money as it's associated with their own campaign finances as well. So as long as we have as Derek said, the apparatus that we have, there's not going to be an ability for any of them to step out and do anything much different.
Jared?
Isn't it interesting, I'm sorry, that Ron Paul from a few years ago had a more left foreign policy critique than Bernie Sanders does. Yeah. And so I think that's something that in terms of what his socialism represents, there's no reason, if he's going to be a standard bearer for the left or for socialism, for him not to have a left critique of U.S. intervention, military hegemony across the globe.
Yeah, exactly. Why do you think that he hasn't ran with that?
Because I think he's deluded himself into thinking he can actually win. So, and he thinks he needs to stay within, even in terms of his rhetoric on socialism, he's careful to talk about, I'm also a progressive, and I like the word progressive. He's careful to sort of talk about capitalism, but crony capitalism. And he felt cornered when Hillary Clinton brought up the things about small businesses, and so he retorted, of course I support small businesses. So I think he actually thinks, because of his experience, his know-how, it could be ego, that he has to position himself in a certain way beyond just what you would think would be his principles. And it could be behind the scenes, he's probably, like, you know, throwing up in the bathroom because he had to say such and such. But he's saying it nonetheless.
But I mean, when I watched that tonight, the first thing I thought of was this was just like when Hillary made Obama disassociate himself from Farrakhan on Meet the Press. Right. It had that same kind of, do you denounce him? Yeah. Denounce him.
Will you go to war?
Right, will you go to war? And then he was like, yes, I'll go kill people just like everybody else.
Yeah.
But I mean, and, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't hear him say anything, speaking of this issue, you know, being this supposed radical, I didn't hear him say anything about drawing down the military-industrial complex or drawing down the military budget. I was reading the platform of the Party for Socialism and Liberation just earlier today, and one of their platform planks is to remove all military bases from around the world and take the $1 trillion that are put into all of that to give everybody everything that we would need here, if not totally for free, damn near close to it. I didn't hear anything along those lines from Bernie, and I think because, as Kamau said, I mean, he thinks he might actually win, and that's a definite no-no.
Why do we always make excuses for strangers and say this is what they believe, this is what they would have said?
I don't. I don't know.
Yeah.
And this is sort of, you know, but I'm also at that point where I have Bill Clinton was the last Democrat I voted for, and that was the first time in '92. And to borrow from Chafee, that's because I was a young military serviceman and I had just left home and I didn't know what was going on. It was my first federal national vote. You know, I didn't know what I was doing. You know, so I'm already at that point. I'm like, you know, we have to move beyond it. And to me, as a wannabe revolutionary, this is the most easy thing to do, to just not vote for one of these two parties and vote somewhere else. I mean, and so I really don't know why, other than this need, or this fear that is encouraged. It is that. It is a fear that is encouraged that if we don't make this vote, we're not only, particularly for black people, disrespecting our ancestors, but then we're turning the world over to something so much worse. And I think that's a straw argument that's constantly and with great success used to limit us.
Sarah, is radical change possible without immediately confronting the war machine?
No, of course
first and
not.
foremost,
Of course not.
right?
And I think that, you know, I argue this a lot with people, is like, I try not to spend a lot of time thinking about what national politicians think and feel in their heart of hearts. Like, I don't care. What he's saying is that he'd go to war. What he's saying is that he'd keep drones. That's awful. That is a thing that we should all be 100% honest about, whether or not we think that it's useful to support Bernie Sanders, or whether we think that it's useful to go somewhere else, or whether we don't vote at all because the whole process is horrifying, which I don't blame anybody who makes that choice either. We have to be real about that is disgusting, and that is the litmus test for somebody to be a serious candidate right now, is to basically say that you drone children. At least Lincoln Chafee brought up the fact that we just bombed a hospital in Afghanistan. Yeah. So at least somebody brought that up. But the former Republican is the one who had to bring that up. What is going on here?
His values have stayed the same, though.
Well, you know,
party's changed.
I mean, if his values are the one who's going to bring up that we just bombed a hospital, at least that's something. I'm glad he was on the stage to say that.
You bring a good point, because, I mean, at least 24 Palestinians have died this week.
Oh, yeah.
You know, in just over a week. I mean, what does this debate mean for them?
We have no idea, because they weren't mentioned.
Right. Well, we know where everyone stands on them, unfortunately.
It means it's the status quo.
Right,
It means
exactly.
that everyone on that stage is crystal clear that they support Israel no matter how many Palestinians are killed, that they support the U.S. giving billions of dollars to Israel, billions of dollars to Egypt, that's a policy that they endorse and that they will continue to enforce. Mm-hmm. They said it by complicitly not saying anything.
Right. I wanted to move on to our Twitter questions. For you, Bhaskar, why can't Bernie win from Brendan Schlesinger?
Why can't Bernie win? Well, in a certain way, I mean, that wouldn't be very good for the left. I mean, I think I would actually be kind of, maybe I haven't actually fully thought this out because I think it's such a far-fetched thing. But I actually think we should worry about people actually seeing Bernie Sanders not be crushed by Hillary Clinton, not seeing the money descend on him and attack him, and actually having this idea that the Democratic Party is theirs to take and reshape. But fundamentally, when it comes to this other question too, like Bernie Sanders is a social democrat. He's not a revolutionary. He's never claimed to be. He did do a great spoken word record that I own, where he recites speeches from so not that kind of spoken word, just spoken word as like reciting speeches from Eugene Debs, which is very unusual to hear him rail on about like all power to the peasants and worker Soviets. That you could hear clips of Bernie Sanders saying that. And also, he's never even been the most left-wing Democrat when he was in the House when it comes to foreign policy. I mean, this is what it is, and we need to be honest when I say critically, I support Bernie Sanders in this primary. I mean, you have to do that without illusions. And if you're doing it with illusions, or you're just not saying that, or you're not calling him out when he needs to be called out, then you're actually there's nothing even productive that can happen out of this. But I think Bernie Sanders just is not considered electable by the people who help frame and make these decisions of the Democratic Party. I don't see it as possible.
But that line though. Go ahead.
Isn't that the whole point? Isn't that the reason for his very existence in the race?
No, I don't think it's that instrumental. I don't think there's a Democratic. I don't think the DNC is that cohesive. I think the Democratic Party as a whole isn't cohesive enough at most levels to make that decision. That's the reason why they couldn't stop Lumumba from running in Jackson. Because if it was like a party, like even like the Labor Party or the Conservatives or whatever, they would have expelled Lumumba. They would have had those mechanisms. So I think it's very important to actually know the U.S. political system and the way in which our political system is different, mostly in ways that hurts the left, but also in ways that make it just more incoherent. Like the Trotskyists were kicked out of the Labor Party in the 80s, militant labor, for being entryist. No one can kick out the Malcolm X grassroots movement. And again, this doesn't resolve that debate or that question of whether to be independent completely or whether to critically use primaries early on in the stages of building something different, but it does complicate it.
But again, that is a very different example than Bernie. And this is my point about, this line of so my question to you or anyone else would be, if we're asked to vote for Bernie without illusions, if we're going into this without illusions, why are we voting for him at all? Or why support him at all? That's the point, that it's the illusions that keep bringing people back. I mean, Obama is what I think, the only hope I had for Obama's election was that this conversation would be rendered moot, that people would then say, look, even if he talks this good game in a Democratic primary, even if he beats the Republican, he's not going to be able to, if that's his true will and his heart, he's still not going to be able to overcome the broader apparatus and bring us the things that he said he was going to bring us. I mean, Obama never mentioned, after his election, never mentioned the Employee Free Choice Act again, something I keep bringing up. Nobody mentioned it here tonight, including Bernie.
Not only that, they didn't mention unions.
Well, that was exactly what I was going to say. That EFCA was supposed to encourage and help people unionize. The workers' defenders here tonight, nobody mentioned any of that at all. And I think this is exactly what happens when you get elected. You talk big game, and then you get elected, and you go right back to this whole thing, and then the movement has to start from scratch. And I think that is...
Yeah, I mean, we are operating in an empire. And we're, the U.S. is an imperial entity that acts like an empire does. Strongest, biggest empire in history. So what are the parameters if someone does happen to get elected and is in office? I mean, what would that person even be able to do? And I'm not talking about someone like Obama, because he was not at all on the same level as Sanders. Jill, do you want to?
Well, I think that it would be interesting, and Sanders actually kept saying repeatedly tonight, it would take millions of people to come out and support if someone like him were to win to further this agenda, because they'd experienced nothing but gridlock, nothing but resistance from the leaders of the parties in Congress.
By the way, I'm sorry, just to add one more thing to that, I heard Hillary say she could beat the Republican nominee, but I didn't hear her or anyone else say that once I get elected, I can override the system that is often reduced to being blamed on the right-wing Republicans, stopping Obama from doing all the great things he was going to do. So none of them even offered that tonight to say, not only will I beat the Republican, but I'll beat the whole right-wing backlash that's going to come after my election. They didn't even bring that up, which is, I think, very telling about, what happens.
We only have about 10 minutes left, you guys, and we're going to afterward take some questions from the audience too. But I wanted to go around and just talk about what do we do? Because I think all of us are on the same page in terms of we want to really see this go somewhere. We don't want to see just another demoralized populace after this election. No matter what happens, I think that we know what probably will happen. What can we do with the energy? Where can we put our efforts right now? Bhaskar?
Well, I think first of all, we should be inspired by certain things in the Sanders campaign. Now, you're seeing that from the very beginning, people thought this was the longest of long shots. Not that Sanders, the question wasn't can he beat Hillary or not. The question is whether he'd get on that stage, whether he could even get to, Jim Webb or Lincoln Chafee levels. I'm actually applaud myself for remembering that guy's name. So I think we should take heart in the fact that we knew that these ideas, even in Sanders' watered-down form, these ideas of economic justice, these ideas of social equality, these ideas resonated with people because they're in the interest of the vast majority. And we knew that we could organize the politics around these ideas. So I think we should take heart in that, and we should actually take that lesson and say we could be open socialist at any stage, and we could tell people that we actually have a program, we actually have a solution, we actually have a way forward.
I mean, in some ways, I agree with some of it. I think there's a crack in the edifice of what America is. And again, I think that crack is leaking in several different directions and in several ways. And so in terms of what can happen, I think Obama is probably as left as what's going to get elected in the United States. And no one really thinks that's left, right? But there are things that he's done that I think can be applauded within the sort of limited confines of what we have. But that's not victory, and that's not really changing a system. That's operating within the confines of something that many of us feel is already corrupted. And so I think the real alternative is things that Jared spoke about and other people alluded to, is that you do have to start at a local level and build up. I think there's things that you do at a national level in terms of spotlighting issues, talking about different concerns. But if you can't have a base, and I think one important thing that we talked about, no matter what I think about the politics of someone like a Farrakhan has a base, right? And you can ride with him or not ride with him. I don't think he cares because he has a base. And he can do many different things with that base that I may want him to do or not do. But I think one of the problems with the left is that we refuse to learn the lessons of building an actual grassroots base. And I think there's historical examples of things like the Nation of Islam, things like the UNIA when it comes to particularly in the black community, that have built programs and done things which have inspired black people in particular. And when we throw out those things because we only want to do policy work, or we only want to do national work, or we only want to do media work, it's to our detriment. We create media stars, but we don't create grassroots change.
And importantly, none of those had electoral political options leading the way. I mean, the UNIA, Nation of Islam, did not put voting for a Democrat as a major part of their platform, and still were this successful.
Politics is different, though. Politics is different because when you have, even at the local level, when you have the existing power structure has access to all of the power, all of the resources, and can dole it out. And so it's very difficult to keep that cohesive base of independent thinkers or people that have a certain agenda when it's easy to peel them off by the establishment because of minor concessions that are given out. And that's what we see happening right now in Baltimore, frankly, with various groups and people that came together to organize after Freddie Gray. And now we're going into these elections, and we're beginning to see some of that happening.
Yeah, I would say that the thing we need to do now is make sure the attention doesn't go off the movements that haven't stopped, right? That they haven't gone completely into electoral politics. That isn't happening all over the place. There are people who are organizing every day and who are, I mean, I've been joking for a while that I'm going to create a map, because every time somebody writes an article about why aren't people in the streets, I'm like, well, on this day they were in the streets in this city, and on this day they were in the streets in this city. And I'm one person and one journalist, and I can cover a tiny bit of it, but it's still happening everywhere, and it's mostly happening unconnected to the electoral process. And I think we need to continue to pay attention to that.
If I could, if there's anything good to be found in any of this, to me, it's that for such a long time now, at least 50 years, polls have showed that an overwhelming majority of American citizens want the things that Bernie and Obama and others have claimed that they would give. The problem, though, the will for these radical changes exists. The problem, though, is that we are corralled back to these institutions that are not giving an electoral voice legitimately to these movements. And that's where, again, I would have to disagree with this idea. You know, it's not the Sanders campaign that's drawing out this sentiment. The sentiment has long existed. It's the Democratic Party recognizing this sentiment has existed for so long and saying, we don't want you going anywhere else. We want to bring you back to get Hillary elected.
Exactly.
Anyone want to respond to that point?
Well, no, I think once again, I agree with a lot of the sentiments. You know, I'm someone who advocates for independent political action wherever I think that's feasible, or even when it's not going to win elections, but where it's going to have an impact. Like, for example, the Howie Hawkins, Brian Jones campaign in New York just got 5% as a campaign I was proud to be a part of, and it was a huge, huge success. You know, and I think that, like, 5% doesn't sound like it could actually beat Cuomo or do anything like that, but people actually doing the organizing saw the impact of just knocking on doors and talking to people and breaking the Democratic Party in New York. And I think immediately in New York, we need to be running openly socialist, openly radical city councilors, whatever. We immediately have the opening in New York. I think at the national level, I don't think Bernie Sanders is put in here and swooped in the DNC. I also think it's a mistake to conflate what Sanders is and what Obama was. I think partially it's a mistake, because even if you're going to come down on the same side, say you oppose them, I think to conflate the programs, and conflate the rhetoric of someone saying that, you know, I'm a socialist and I want to tax the billionaire class, with the very waffling kind of Bill Clinton-esque. No,
he didn't. No, he didn't say he was a socialist, but he said he wanted to tax. No, but what I'm saying is he didn't. Without the language, he said his program, particularly in the primaries in 2008, was exactly the same. I want to go after big Wall Street. We're going to bring them down. We're going to tax all these people. We're going to give money to. It was the same platform. But really, my point isn't to conflate Obama and Sanders. It's to draw a parallel to the impact that they are intended to have on the rest of us. That's the point I'm trying to get at. I'm not saying they're exactly the same, although I do think programmatically they are. What I am saying is that they're there, their presence exists to gather up this already existing sentiment within the large majority of the people in this country that says, we don't want what is this status quo. That's where I'm saying that there's a parallel, not necessarily in their individual politics or character.
Kamau, do you have any response?
I mean, I agree with that, and I think one of the sort of the direct answers as to why Bernie Sanders won't get elected is because Wall Street will not let him get elected, and those who bank American politicians will not allow that to happen. And I think that's represented even in what we saw through the corporate media question asking tonight. And what we talked about earlier is sort of stake what your position is. And we're going to show that even if, and I agree somewhat, I think he, on his own, decided that he wanted to do this. He thought maybe the time was right without much encouragement from the Democratic Party. It's like, well, we don't know if we want you to do that. But I think he decided he did. But I also agree that I think they think it's okay that he did, right?
Yes.
I don't think they're necessarily opposed because there is that sentiment that has been out there for now 10, 15 years that's only gotten stronger since the sort of Great Recession, that something is seriously wrong. People are moving in different directions around how they want to challenge what they think is wrong. And he captures a certain segment which traditionally does vote Democrat anyway. So I think Bernie Sanders has a limited sort of lifespan because in the current structure that we do have of this two-party system, he's not electable because the rich bankers and so forth, media apparatuses will not allow him to go any further. They will demonize him, and it will turn off folks, and it will feel like Hillary Clinton is the only possibility.
Jill, do you agree?
Absolutely, I agree. But I think it happens all the time. We're now, and we have got Bernie Sanders, but it happened 20 years ago or so with Jesse Jackson. It happened in the last election with Dennis Kucinich and John Edwards, who were speaking very much to this. And at the end of the day, it boiled down to sticking to the Democrat nominee, and all they did is keep people in the fold, thinking, well, maybe the one that actually got nominated is going to carry some of that with them.
Oh, boy just screamed. He wasn't even a socialist.
Sarah, do you want to close out with something?
No, that's okay. I'm good.
Well, I think it's a really incredible and exciting time. I really appreciate all of your input, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming out. I think it's an incredible time, much different than 2008 in terms of the rhetoric and in terms of the energy, because people are really fed up, and they really, really appreciate the strong statements from Bernie, just totally calling out these elite people. And I think it was really refreshing. I loved it, but I agree that we need something massive behind him. He even said that. So it's up to us. It's up to all of us to really harness this energy, take it on, continue the dialogue, continue the conversation, and it's up to all you guys too. So thank you so much. That's all the time we have for tonight. Thanks to our panelists and our live studio audience for joining us for the very special edition of the Empire Files. Be sure to catch all new episodes of the show every Friday night, 10 Eastern, streaming on TELUS or English. And let us know what you thought on Twitter at Empire Files. Have a great night, everyone.
No questions. No questions.
Do some questions from the